Hi everyone.
Hi everyone.
What we have for you today is something very different indeed. It's a unique take on Jeffrey Epstein, and we look at psychoanalyzing his character in the light of human nature at its most fundamental level. So we're going to address what's called the Freud-Adler-Jung Equation, and we do so with some of our most senior students. So we hope that you enjoy it, and we'll see you soon.
Yes, see you soon. Thank you very much.
Bye. Right, so what we have here is a very unusual approach to the recent phenomenon of what's been happening with Jeffrey Epstein and his circle. So on the card then, we have the title Psychoanalyzing Epstein, and then as a subtitle, the Freud-Adler-Jung Equation. So our approach today is going to follow the Freud-Adler-Jung equation, which you guys know exists in two forms. There's the negative one and the positive one. And the negative one involves what happens in psychodynamic terms when we get fixated at one or the other of the first two of those stages. That's Freud and Adler. If we don't navigate those, we never get to Jung. Now, what can happen with people who either are decent human beings who suffer is that they get stuck at Freud or Adler, and that the only Jung they ever sample is as a fantasy. The problem with that is that they haven't actually solved Freud and Adler before they get to the level of the fantasy. The fantasy then defines the outcome of the neurosis that they've been suffering from as they've navigated their life thus far by, first of all, facing the challenge of Freud and then the challenge of Adler. And again, just for the sake of clarity, Jung himself said that no one should go near his work until they've understood Freud and Adler completely enough to make the transition to his ideas. And he thought around the age of 35, during his lifetime, roughly the onset again in his day of middle age, was about right. So he did not recommend younger people go directly. In fact, nobody should go directly to his work according to him, but they should meet the challenges of the first half of life. Now, plenty of people who suffer find refuge in Jungian ideas. And as you guys know, there's a danger of inflation, of corrosive fantasy that leads to schizoid withdrawal, that kind of thing. We've discussed this before. But that's with normal people who suffer in a normal way along their lifespan development. What happens, though, when we deal with the phenomenon of evil? Ordinary evil or extraordinary evil? And when it comes to Epstein, and there's no real need to go into any depth, any lurid details about what happened with him, his circle and his victims, that's well known, and more's going to come online about that obviously going forward. But what happens with them? How do they deal with this Freud-Adler-Jung equation? Well, first of all, let's just have a reminder of what it is. These are metaphors. It's not literally Freud, not literally Adler, not literally Jung, but it's what they represent. And it seems it's been a quirk or a synchronicity, if you like, of human history, cultural history, that these three men each specialize in something that relates to deep structure within human nature. So Freud, rather famously or even infamously, dealt with negative instincts, what he called the id. And as you guys again will know, that was mainly sexuality and violence, aggression, hostility, that kind of thing. And that was a product of the demographic he was working with in the 1890s in Vienna. An awful lot of late Victorian frustration of a sexual kind, which generally converted itself into hostility, which was aimed at other people, or retroflected, which means turned on ourselves, in the form of hysteria and other such symptoms. So Freud was concerned with instinct, with that part of the human psyche which we have in common with other animals. There are human instincts, modifications of instinct, which are uniquely human. The fundamentals are so deeply ingrained that they don't go away. And according to Freud, they were fundamental. Now, the rest of Freud's elaborated theory, we don't need to concern ourselves with, but we should take him as being representative of that. And as the psychodynamic model evolved, that was the first thing, the first formalized school of psychodynamic psychotherapy. But there is a caveat, of course, and that's Pierre Janet, who's often left out of the consideration because he was not an English speaker, native or otherwise. He spoke only in French, he wrote in French, and he was a very, very significant figure. And he's kind of another link, if you like, an almost forgotten link between all three of these men and others who came later. And he's key in many ways, but mainly as a kind of an enzyme or a catalyst to bring the other three into proper alignment with one another. But anyway, let's return to the problem of what happens when a dark triad individual, their life negotiates these adaptive stages and they get fixated. Where do they tend to get fixated at? Is it the same as an ordinary person who suffers from a neurosis, or is there something very, very different about them? Well, I think it's fair to say, Paul, I don't know if you'd agree, but in our experience, there's almost no difference in the progression, but there's a difference in the quality of what happens when such a person gets fixated. And that quality, many people, particularly academics, regard as an issue of a personality disorder. Whereas our view, borrowing from Jung and Jung's understanding of what a persona is, that is to say, not the real personality, but a representation of something, we would say even the term personality disorder is insufficient to explain what's actually going on with so-called dark triad types. For us, it's a disorder of character. And when we were young, that was the thing that was important, just in ordinary everyday life. For example, for employment, somebody might want a character reference. They didn't ask for a personality reference. They wanted a character reference. That's in all sorts of occupations. Again, when we were young, that was the favorite thing. But within academic psychology, they started to, over many decades, develop all sorts of what they call personality inventories, psychometric tests of personality. But again, if we compare that with Jung's notion of persona, then what it's actually measuring is probably not what it claims it's measuring. It's actually measuring character, but it's become mixed up with the notion of personality. And when we speak in common parlance of everyday people, to have a good personality usually means they're extroverted, they're bubbly, they're outgoing. But we know that that's a facade, that that's not the real person. So personality disorder doesn't describe character, but character is fundamental to human nature. So a dark triad type will have, in our view, a disorder of character, and we would refer to Jung and Jung's notion of persona to make that distinction. So wherever, for example, Jeffrey Epstein was like to whoever he adjusted to when he met them, that would be crafted again like a Jungian persona. And if he is was a dark triad type, I don't think there's much doubt about that. And he had a disordered character fundamentally at the level of his genome. It's a molecular disturbance, which also is in a state of field resonance with all of the fields that organize the genome and releases lifespan development. If it's that bad and he's that clever about manipulating his persona, then he will be able to craft that persona to engage with whoever he needed to in order to manipulate them to meet his own needs. And there's the big clue. The first level of disturbance in such a person, just as it is with a normal individual, is at the level of instinct. But what makes Freud really applicable is the fact that Freud looked at negative instincts, disturbances in sexuality and hostility. And to do what Jeffrey Epstein did, he would need a disturbance at the level of instinct under both of those categories. He would be a sexual pervert and he would be a sadist. But his persona, his personality that he would use psychosocially to influence others would be weaponized to hide his character. Now, a further prediction would be on the basis of this model, which is retrospective to some extent because we can see what he was like, is that he would be capable of manipulating that character so successfully, so intelligently, so cunningly, that people would overrate his intelligence when they realized that they've been manipulated. And what I'm saying here, I think, is an important distinction to understand. Psychopaths aren't necessarily intelligent in an academic sense. They're just cunning. They're cunning about meeting their needs, and they are driven towards meeting their needs. So their libido, as Jung understood it, so therefore not only Freud and sexuality, but their life force is all about gratification, and everything downstream of that is based upon it. So the level of disturbance for Jeffrey Epstein at the level of Freud would have to do with his intense interest in meeting his own gratification. So we can move on to Adler at this point just briefly and say that Adler is about social adaptation, about relating. If somebody comes out, so to speak, with a severe maladaptation of Freud, they're going to stand out because culture has all sorts of ways of dealing with that. But in order to get your own way, then, if you are primarily driven in that way, is that you must conceal Freud behind Adler, in other words, behind psychosocial relationships. That's the first level at which manipulation will occur. Adler's understanding of that was an attempt at overcoming a sense of inferiority. And a lot of views on personality disorders, such as dark triad types, is that they actually do have a deep sense of insecurity and inadequacy, which means that they overcompensate. Adler picked up on that, but he normalized it. He said that it's not just the so-called personality disorders, it's something we all have to adapt to. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier, that there's not that much difference in terms of mechanism between an ordinary person who suffers from a neurosis and someone who has a character disorder that is so fundamental, it is immutable. But the main difference is motivation. The motivation for gratification is intense in people like this, and then their capacity to manipulate. So this is why we say the Freud-Adler-Jung equation, and we're going to look at the negative side of that first before we move on to the positive, which will be key in understanding how we can deal with people like this by building good people. I don't mean good weak either, I mean good strong. And good strong cultures that are resilient to catabolic states of collapse, where they are all the people involved, or most of the influential ones, are groomed and manipulated by a few very, very high functioning, character disordered, evil people. So I'll just pause that. And would you like to add anything?
Well, I would just add a brief nuance to that, Steve, because as you rightly say, we're going to move through the pathology into a more positive version of Freud, Adler and Jung. But a nuance there might be, say, as with somebody like Epstein, if we're thinking in an Adlerian sense, or at least at the point of delivery of his personality, behind which is his character, he may appear to be positive in terms of his psychosocial adaptation. Yeah. Because he had such a big circle of people around him, and there was a lot of manipulation of those people going on. So to all intents and purposes, from an Adlerian perspective, he could actually appear to be very well adapted psychosocially. Yeah. But it's what that conceals. Yeah. And the motivation that you spoke about with respect to his own gratification. So that's the distinction. That's what makes him different, separate to a normal person who might be suffering from some kind of Freud-Adler-Jung pathology. Yeah. And in fact, it's all the difference in the world. I mean, that's really important to emphasize that for anybody who's watching, that it is in a completely different category of disorder. Yeah. It's out there all on its own, in effect. Yeah. So there should be no misunderstanding about that too. If anyone's watching and they're a little bit vulnerable in any way, it's night and day. We're not talking about the same thing when we're talking about normal people who are suffering. in a specific way. It's a very, very different situation. So I would just add that in as we go through, because there will be a lot of nuance probably to what we say.
There's the ordinary problem of everyday evil, which Jungians like to call the shadow. We can address that soon. But that's such an amorphous concept, really, that it covers collective evil as well. But it also locates it in a religious way inside individuals. And that will affect people who are suffering from neurosis more than anyone, because they lack the robustness in a Piaget way of resisting the suggestion that such a thing exists and applies to them. So the very concept of the shadow is itself highly suggestive in a destructive way to people who are suffering. And that's something we need to look at, and then also see, does that actually work with this guy? And the Jungians have an answer for that, and I think it's a very weak one, but we do need to look at it. So can we throw it open for any questions at this stage to anyone who'd like to contribute? Everyone okay on that? Okay. Right, let's move to the next card. Right, so I mentioned this just before, but just to put it into some perspective, this is not real. I'm sure you've guessed that, because when they were at their respective ages, sadly, those three men wouldn't be seen together like this. And again, just to flag up that's been a great pity for the development of psychodynamic psychotherapy and psychoanalysis generally, that they each made a great contribution. And the reason it's captioned as three turns of the wheel is that there is an exact correlation, you could argue, between this and between the three different branches of Buddhism. Hinayana, Theravada, which is the prime example of that, or the narrow path, was the first, and that's Freud. Mahayana, the greater vehicle, which was open to everyone, that's the social side, if you like. Well, that's Adler. And then Vajrayana, esoteric, tantric Buddhism, well, that's Jung. And the tantric Buddhists say, just like Jung says of Adler and Freud, that you need to learn the other two first before you can go near that. So there's a deep structure, correspondence, if you like, at a field level, an understanding that some systems of representation and experience need to be followed in a specific order, because each of those systems collapses around a specific thing, makes a specialism of them. And in the case of these three great pioneers, it was their individual personality. And Jung was very clear about that each of their theories was a statement that came out from their personalities. So when we work the Freud-Adler-Jung equation, we are bringing forward an echo of their individual personalities. Anything you'd like to bring
the
up
field of their personality, actually, which still exists, it's still with us now, isn't it?
That's true. That's very true. That's very important, actually, for therapists in particular, but also for people who are into personal development. Because when we access what remains of the memory of these three people, then we bring online everything about them that is available to bring online, and probably a little bit more. And I would refer to Michael Levin on that. This idea, he talks about ingression, of a free lunch. In other words, you get more than you ask for or more than you've paid for sometimes when you access representations of information. And we found this to be true clinically, and we've been able to utilize that therapeutically as well. And we've quite deliberately done that. It's almost shamanistic when it's done positively, but when it runs without any kind of understanding or constraint, then you can get the dark side of these men's personalities coming through, and their conflicts come through, their beliefs and their writings and their suggestions, and we can internalize them. They can damage us, and we can pass them on through suggestion to our patients. So it's important to understand what we're up against, and this is one reason why we talk about a positive and a negative version of this equation. It works. It's empirically pressure tested. It seems to be real. It seems to access real deep structure psychodynamics and what we call infodynamics. But if we don't know what we're working with, then we run the risk of bringing things in that we did not bargain for or understand. But this is the application, if you like, that we're going to process Jeffrey Epstein as a collective phenomenon of human nature through this equation. Would anybody like to ask anything or comments at this point? Everything clear? Okay, we can move on to the next card. Lead in. Okay, so this one really is just clarification on the last point. The three gentlemen now have stood up and they look rather stern, because this is going to represent the negative pole, if you like, of this equation and what goes wrong. So Freud seeks Adler. In other words, instinct seeks Adler, as Adler being the representation of the power principle to deliver on the instinctive need for gratification. There, if you like, the normal levels at which most people generally operate at. For most people, Jung will come in at the level of fantasy or the representation of fantasies, unless people are sophisticated enough to understand exactly where that comes from in terms of religion, philosophy, transpersonal experiences, and the like. So Freud seeks Adler, and then Adler conceals Freud. We see this in politicians all the time. And it's coming out now really clearly how many of these politicians globally have been so corrupt that beneath it is pure Freud. It's all been concealed behind an Adlerian gloss, and then sometimes some ideological elevation, which we could say is the Jungian elements, because it's collective and it's supposed to be transpersonal. It's a look over here moment, like here, look at this, look, I'm a principled conviction politician. And it turns out they're not. They're just a Freudian pervert who's hiding behind the gloss of Adler, firstly, and then with a hint of Jung. So this is what this particular representation is for, just for the sake of clarity.
Can I just add to that, Steve? There is I think right now too, a lot of virtue signaling going on by people who, and this, everything is relative, isn't it? Who, relative to say somebody like Epstein, actually appears to be quite virtuous, but you know, clearly they're not, for the reasons that you've just said. That, I was just saying that there's a lot of virtue signaling going on now amongst the likes of politicians and others who have Adlerian motivations in the way that you've described, and the reason that they're kind of getting away with talking about Epstein is because relative to Epstein, they will appear to be relatively innocuous. So I think we're seeing a lot of virtue signaling going on, people actually utilizing what's going on collectively to benefit themselves in some way. So you could then argue, even for those people, that Adler is concealing Freud, that they're getting something out of somebody else being the focus of the evil, which, you know, clearly Epstein, you know, was evil, but they're concealing some of their own evil behind his, because it's, in relative terms, it appears to be lesser than the kind of evil that is represented by him. So I think it's just something to bear in mind, that people do this kind of thing, and of course they do it to a lesser extent as well in ordinary everyday life, where they, through something like transference, apportion blame to somebody to make themselves look better or more virtuous in some way. But it's the same dynamic that you've described, and this is why really the Freud-Adler-Jung equation is such a useful tool, because it's pretty much applicable across the board. When we're looking at human nature and human interaction, I'm not saying it's foolproof, but it's pretty much always present when you look for it.
Yes, it's incredible how useful it is, actually. So even with people who just suffer in a normal way, decent people who are suffering, once the darker side of their instincts come through in compensation, and then they get surprised by that. This is what Freud was finding, that the people felt morally challenged.
Yeah.
Hence, he created the superego or superego as a kind of moral complex to help interpret these transitional phases that people go through, both in childhood when they're learning and then when they may become neurotic. But a punishing superego, which basically is retroflected against us as a moral complex, that allows us to be manipulated as well. Because the superego, the Freudian superego or superego, is built, according to Freud, by relating to the parents initially, because they are the authority figures which then form the basis for all subsequent authority figures that we meet. And hence, for Freud, that was why parental transferences came up first when someone's instincts were being frustrated psychosocially, and that includes within therapy. But it's important to note on the inside, for personal development, we can play these games with ourselves, because not only is there internal projection, there's internal transference. What we internally project over the unconscious in the form of our complexes, we can then play those aspects off against one another. And then homeostasis, in a positive way, can receive a negative internal transference from the ego to protect the ego and its field of complexes from corrective homeostasis. So anything that can go out can also go in from the perspective of the ego. But this is something that's not generally aware, if you like, amongst the psychodynamic field as a whole. But would anybody like to raise any questions on this?
Yes, Steve, if and this may not be the right correlate, but as a question, you've mentioned the polarity a couple times.
Yeah.
And an observable phenomena is that you'll see, for example, you may have, I'm looking at like hiring processes as an example in this context. And it's like, okay, I see this person who intuit that they have some Freudian drive issues manifesting, like maybe poor impulse control as an example.
Mm-hmm.
And yet from a reduction, you'll hear others maybe less informed say, well, their person, they're heavily invested in, they're involved in their church body and this type of thing. Yet a more informed view, I see that they're putting this energy in displacing this pathology at the Freudian level, and they're putting the energy into, say, in this example, maybe church. And I see that pattern quite a bit, where it's like they're heavily invested in the wrong way. It intuits. I'm not sure maybe how to say that, but it's a direct correlate to the level of libido over here in this Freudian pathology, or the lack that they have suffered there, that they haven't learned to manage, or maybe it's a character issue, and but they're heavily invested over here. You see that sometimes in the choosing of professions as well, similar construct, where it's like, I choose this profession because otherwise I would be doing this other thing. Is that relative to what you're talking about?
Yes, thank you for that, Bob. There's so many different superpositioned states that we have to negotiate, obviously, in development, that we learn how, or we should do, according to Freud again, how to resolve inner pressure and outer pressure within the ego's understanding of itself. And that should lead, according to Freud, to a proper or reasonably enough adaptation. Now, where Adler steps in at that point would be to say that we develop instead, rather than just adaptations, neurotic alibis, guiding fictions, fictional finalism, which pretty much speak for themselves. But for him, it was all to do with a sense of inferiority. As we grow, when we're children, we have no power. Everybody else is more powerful. So a feeling of inferiority is, for him, Adler, the principal thing that we have to adapt to. We either give in and become submissive, or we become dominant in compensation for feeling lacking of power. Okay, so if we accept all of that, what would it look like? It would look in everyday terms exactly as you've described it, where there'll be different superposition drives and adjustments, complexes in a Jungian sense, that would have formed around our timeline, our trajectory of adaptation. And then that produces the very specific configurations that individuals have at the persona level. But behind the persona, those maladaptations will be, now in a Pierre-Janet sense, we can bring Janet into the equation, will be operating autonomously to maintain themselves in case they are needed originally. And then they, in a Jungian sense, become so autonomous that they look after themselves rather than the ego. And then all sorts of rebalancing goes on the inside again, which produces a general maladaptation that could be called a state of neurosis. And then it's the task of the therapist to untangle this web of associations and layers of maladaptations to find out what's really going on. And of course, the theory gets in the way. And the tendency is to collapse into one of them over the others when it comes to psychodynamic therapy. But our model has always been to look at the ground state of the individual. So the theory is secondary to the observation. And the observation is not static, it is interactive. It's a field-based relationship that informs the observation. So it's not an observation looking to justify a theory. It's an interaction which then needs a way to systematize and pressure test itself. And then we look at the theories and say which of these or which combination of them is going to be most adapted in this moment. And once we've got that, we pressure test it again. That should be the way with therapy, and it should be that way with personal development too. We should pressure test everything.
Yeah, that's very helpful. But one of the questions I didn't ask, you answered there, which was trying to help the layperson maybe to go, look, this is what you're dealing with. And the problem they have is they're seeing one representation of maybe this adaptive process somebody's engaged in, say hyper-religiosity or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And it's really what they're not seeing is the field and where's this pressure coming from and what needs are being met here. And it's really, this is, as in this example, this is an adaptive because there's some Freudian unresolved issues here.
Yeah.
And so you're seeing this pressure. So it's where's the pressure coming from for this behavior, and what is homeostasis in this case?
Yeah.
Really here, what are we trying to balance out? And so that is the challenge for the nascent or layperson, is they're not reading the whole field. They're just seeing their one representation. And you brought, I mean, that's obvious, but you brought it to mind there. It's like, how do I help you see this? I get a lot of problems with that, trying to help people make decisions because they're not seeing the whole field.
Yeah.
And they're not really capable really of seeing the whole field. So you got to find a way to explicate that for them, that they can grasp it and move forward with a good sound decision. So thank you, that helped.
Thank you, Bob.
Yeah, I think the problem with those kind of scenarios, Bob, is that people who are in that state are more likely to be a problem to other people if they are actually maintaining a state of homeostasis, in the sense that they're, from their own perspective, they're not particularly suffering in any way, and they are able to resolve those drives, those instincts in a way which is agreeable to them. Then it's just a case of scale, isn't it? From the ordinary layperson who's trying to manage their own stresses, essentially, you know, the pressure from within and pressure from without, and talking about, say, somebody like Epstein, who, with respect to people who are doing it in that way, is off the scale, really. But the underlying dynamic is similar in the sense that it's all about fundamental gratification. And any of us may or may not be able to persuade someone to move away from or out of that state, particularly if the gratification is such that it doesn't want to be challenged. I think people have to be in a state where they are suffering sufficiently that there's enough reflexivity online for them to be open to the possibility of there being something else, of there being another level of adaptation that they could aspire to. But I think a lot of people, just a lot of lay people, as you describe them, are within their own perspective, adapted.
Yeah.
And so even if we offer things, even if we can see their field, and we can sense that maybe it would be better for them to be different in their adaptation, they may just simply be resistant to it.
Yeah.
And I think there has to be, and this is where the suffering comes into it. I think there has to almost be a sufficient amount of suffering for people to want to move out of or beyond that state, for them to even seek help in the first place. And then you get somebody like Epstein, who it just works for him so well that he's not actually suffering in the way that the average person would suffer. For him, he's completely content in a way with where he's at with respect to his own adaptation. So these things are fraught with difficulty, aren't they, in a way? But you make a very good and salient point, Bob. I think particularly when you're able to see into somebody's situation or into their field, and you know that it would be better not just for them but for the people around them if they were different, but they're not prepared to receive. They're not prepared to receive anything from you in the way of a suggestion about how they might improve things. It's just, you kind of met with a brick wall at that point.
Again, it's back to this: how are we defining homeostasis? What is this individual balancing? And so, like from a personnel selection perspective, what I see frequently is that because of this high libido interest over here in the Freudian level that they've not resolved, then their energy is put into the Jungian area, where they're really working in a transcendent. And from an outward, uninformed view, it's like, well, this person has changed trajectory. It's like, no, they're under pressure, significant pressure from the wrong place, and at some point, that's a fail. That will fail. There will be something in their structure they've set up about their world that, while they're maybe trying to maintain, or there may be an opportunity or some supporting structure failure, where that libido interest, because it's not resolved, they'll return to the Freudian drive, and you have a catastrophe because you've brought this person into your organization or your circle, and so that's having to see that, as you said, having to see the whole field. And so where's this energy coming from, and what are we trying to resolve here? What really are you calling balance or homeostasis in this moment?
Yeah, great observations, Bob. So a lot of people who are of dubious character tend to find God, in inverted commas. We've known a lot of people like that, and it seems to be a temporary holding space. And we can say that operates at the Jungian level. It's as if they need a bigger bully than they are. So the idea of a deity who is all powerful, controlling them as the only control they have over them, has a homeostatic effect, which can be temporarily positive, but it takes a lot of energy for someone who is fundamentally, should we say, of insufficient character, to maintain that transpersonal level, and then the collapse occurs. And as you guys know, we've talked about the eruption column of a volcano, and the pyroclastic flow. It collapses down itself and then spreads out at the base. So when the collapse comes, it drops out of the sky, literally away from the Jungian level of inflation, down through power, and then out. It distributes laterally at the level of Freud, and the desire to gratify overwhelms, because that is their configuration. And it takes a lot of effort to maintain the pseudo-religious level of transcendence at the Jungian level. And one way that you can see that that's the case is that they collapse their personality, not their character, but their personality, around the religious level. And then you know that is homeostatic. And knowing the rest of their field, when I say homeostatic, it is performing a homeostatic function at that level to keep the cap on things, and also prevent the collapse too. So it has to be continually energized. But you can tell, because people collapse around the religious ideas, that's their justification for everything they do if they're pressured. But the internal state is a contradiction to that. And so you get people who are religious and live a contradictory life, and then you get projection and transference. So such a guy might have a problem with a substance or alcohol, or he might assault his wife and family, but the persona at the inflated level is very religious.
Yeah, it might be even more influential than that. And somebody say even like Carl Rogers, who lived his life in that way.
He did,
unfortunately, and was having relationships with patients while maintaining these religious ideas at the same time about himself. So I mean that's a kind of a higher profile example of somebody who lives their life like that and is within the therapy field as well. And they, we have to watch out for this.
We do.
We can't be naive about it.
We do. And so oh, sorry, Bob, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, you didn't. Don't you worry. So when it comes to people like Epstein and his circle, what kind of religious, register are they going to occupy? Some of them may have come through orthodox religions where there was a high moral value in terms of when they were educated and they had their early life. But it seems that a lot of them coalesce into the more occult and dark side of the representations of religion, because that then reinforces the Freudian pathology and the Adlerian pathology. It justifies it at the level of inflation. And the fact that they believe at the Adlerian level that they're untouchable means there's nowhere else to go but into a perverted version of Jung that is being fed by a perverted or corrupted Freud and a perverted or a corrupted Adler. And there you see the Freud-Adler-Jung equation acted out perfectly. With Epstein, though, like a lot of psychopaths, he had the capacity to see into himself and accept himself. In the Steve Bannon interview, you've probably seen it, where he's asked if he's the devil incarnate. And he summated that eventually by saying, no, but I have a very good mirror. So he's admitting two things there. He's a narcissist, and that he's conscious of being one, and he's conscious of what he is fully, and he finds no conflict within himself for being that way. And you do find with a lot of dark triad types that they will tell you that they are one. It's just whether you listen or not. So that's a feature. I mean, if you see this Steve Bannon interview, it's very clear. And other information's come out about the kind of occult practices and so on that he and the associates were involved in. That sustains the inflation by drawing on the fuel, which is fundamentally Freudian, gratification through power, then achieves a corrupted level of Jung. The problem with that is that once it pops, it will collapse. And it'll be interesting to see what happens now with what's going on with these people globally. They are being seen through. And the reaction to that will impact them first at a Freudian level, which will take all the heat out of the Jungian and Adlerian levels, which will collapse down. And then the prediction would be, we'll see them doubling back, which will be that as that energy collapses into the Freudian level, they must preserve themselves at all costs. And all the illusions that occur higher up the chain at the Adlerian level that they've been seen through, the Jungian level, we know what they are. So it has to be gratification. That's their level of survival, and that will amp up. So that will be a prediction, at least in some cases. It depends how efficiently homeostasis at a higher cultural and psychosocial level can deal with their tendency to do that, to collapse into their strength and then bounce back up again.
Thank you. That's the IPSA providing linguistics, the format and the overlay, being able to speak to these topics is what brings them to saliency. For demonstrative, if you want to be able to see and understand, you have to put words to it. Sometimes you can intuit, but not really. And so then being able to go forward and speak with it then is the path, to resolve these things, or at least become aware of them.
Yeah. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you.
Would anybody else like to contribute?
Steve,
yes, Steve, go ahead.
I'm just thinking you can't leave Ghislaine Maxwell out of the equation with Epstein as well. And how using the IPSA model, just how she would have been attracted to someone like him and how they would have got into a relationship with her background with her father and the embezzlement and everything else of pension funds, and why she'd be attracted to someone like Epstein. And you'd wonder the dynamics then that happened within that relationship, because it started off as a romantic, but then it's kind of, I think she might have been put to the side. But she was still embedded in that whole.
Yeah.
So it was probably innately her nature as well.
Yeah, Paul.
Well, I think you see it, Niamh, don't you, with lots of couples that we might ultimately think of as being psychopathic. I mean, there were couples in the past like Myra Hindley, Ian Brady, and others, where you get what is essentially a higher and lower functioning psychopath working together in tandem. And I think this is probably what we're seeing here as well with Ghislaine. And in a way, it shouldn't be surprising to us. It is really just a matter of scale in terms of evil, isn't it? From ordinary level relating right the way up to the way in which you see psychopathic couples relating to one another. So and then of course there will be her Adler and her desire for Freudian gratification, and then all the esoteric stuff that comes with that, and the vast amount of money and wealth and resources which feed back into the gratification of instinct again, which in a way we've talked about this before in terms of women and instinctive needs, which are essentially Paleolithic. But again, that's what you're seeing, but you're seeing it ramped up by these evil motivations that these people have. But fundamentally, that's what it is. And she's in jail now, of course, but she is still there. So she is a presence. It will be interesting to see really how that situation is managed with Ghislaine. I mean, there is talk about her being maybe freed early and so on. There's seems to be some negotiation going on around that. And if that does happen, I think it will be interesting to see the timing of her release as well.
Yeah, and the alibis for it.
Of course, absolutely. Yes, which will spring up all over the place.
Yeah, whose vested interest to serve.
Yes, yeah.
And how long will she survive once she's out? Because she'll be dangerous to other people, for as long as
incredibly dangerous. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got a Ghislaine card later.
We have got a Ghislaine card coming up, yes.
Yeah. Which we can look at.
Yeah.
Thank you,
Niamh.
Thanks. Okay, let's go on to the next card. Thank you. So we have covered this, but just to make it clear with this as a graphic then, the negative Freud-Adler-Jung equation. Freud seeks Adler, Adler conceals Freud, Jung inflates and falls victim to both. So that's the way that it goes under normal conditions. So just to be clear again, to remove any doubt from anyone who may be watching this who's unfamiliar with our approach, these representations are that and that alone. And we're not saying that this is Freud himself, Adler himself, or Jung himself, but what they represent. So what we have here, of course, is Freud, and he has a mask, a persona, which is Adler. So what we're saying here is that when Freud seeks Adler, Adler then conceals Freud, in other words, becomes a mask for Freud. And then as it goes into the Jungian level, that's when the inflation occurs. And that's poor old Carl in the background in a state of rhapsodic inflation. So this is the negative version of that equation. Would anybody like to ask anything on this one? Be okay? Right, okay, this is a bit more of a graphic representation of Freud seeking Adler, the hand on the shoulder from behind. And the reason this is here is to emphasize that we cannot do away with Freud simply by overwriting him with a consciousness, a personal consciousness, which is focusing only on our relating. If we ignore Freud, he is still there. And he will seek to occupy our ego and our libido. And then what happens is, of course, he's covered up, he's concealed by our outer appearance, by our relating. Freud seeks Adler. Right, let's move on to the next one. And this is a continuation of that. We have Adler conceals Freud, where basically Freud is hiding behind the Adlerian mask. But if we look properly, we can see it. So we can see, there's Freud just sticking his head out around the corner there. We know he's there. That's a level of consciousness that we need to have at all times. Because instincts are conscious unto themselves, and they are intended by evolution to fulfill themselves. And these instincts are not just Panksepian drives. They include entire scenarios of adaptation and advantage competitively, which is where Darwin, who's the hidden figure behind Freud, comes into the equation. In order to be successful in an adaptive sense, then Freud must merge with Darwin, and Darwin must merge with Freud. But Darwin is not only psychology. He includes biology and includes any kind of competition, even at a material or physical level between things. There is a selective process at work. So Darwin is the hidden factor behind Freud, but the two work together very, very well.
The Brothers Grimm, as we call them.
Yeah, the Brothers Grimm, they're always there.
Yeah.
And one will have his hand on your left shoulder and one on the right. And if they pull together, you have to fall backwards. So it's far better that you have firm ground beneath your feet and understand what's going on, whilst we might be preoccupied with a career or with acquiring power over other people, that we haven't done away with Freud, we haven't done away with Darwin, and there's someone even behind Darwin as well, which we can come to later. Okay, so this is Jung inflate. So there he is. He's off on his inflationary rhapsody towards God knows where.
The hot air of inflation.
The hot air of inflation, and Freud and Adler are looking up, bemused, but saying, there he goes again. It's happening again. It happens all the time. So Jung inflates at this point. And for the ordinary person, this can be an escape into fantasy and away from outer adaptation, which both Freud and Adler ultimately are concerned with. So Jung is escaping the constraints. But if this is someone like Jeffrey Epstein and his circle who are inflating like that, that, as we said earlier, is where all the occult, pseudo-religious stuff comes in order to provide an end goal for the drive, the over-amped drive that's coming through Freud and Adler needs to have a fictional goal, what Adler called fictional finalism. So we'll go all religious and occult, and that will be the goal. That's what we're looking for. That will satisfy us. We can calm down. Everything will be fine when we do that. But what happens when they arrive at the Jungian level, the pseudo-Jungian level? Freud and Adler not being reconciled, but are now very, very voracious of libido and of consuming other people, literally, sometimes, will take over the Jungian level as well. And it's unregulated. That kind of ordinary homeostasis that we all need in our lives is broken down to them.
So this is pathological Jung.
This is pathological Jung. It's not good Jung. It's not Jung the way he should be, or what he should represent. And can be. And we'll be coming to that. But this is when things go wrong at the Jungian level. It doesn't escape, though it looks like it is, doesn't escape from Adler or from Freud, because both of them are corrupted at that particular level, and that means that Jung is necessarily corrupted. And in the life of Epstein and his associates, we see that very clearly. Anybody like to comment or ask a question?
If this is an appropriate card, yes, please.
Yeah, sure do.
And if it turns out this should have been on 2 ago, that's okay. But so we have to take it out of the metaphorical, from Jung inflates and falls victim to both. That falls victim to both. Can we come out of the metaphor and maybe bring that from the abstract to what that looks like? Falls victim to both.
Yeah. So in the case of an ordinary person who is not evil, but is just simply neurotic, then when they can no longer maintain the fantasy, the compensation, if you like, comes about because all the libido drops back down. And in a relationship, say a marriage relationship, what you'll see when if that's under stress and the infatuation phase, the inflationary stage is gone, then people get into conflict. And firstly, they do that through Adler. They do it through the power game between them. And then that will descend down into Freud. Now, during the descent, there'll be an overlap between Adler and Freud. So there will be power that will involve the control and manipulation of instinct, either through the physical side of the relationship, for example, or by moving outside of the relationship and introducing third parties, that kind of thing, which will be intended to bring about the end of the relationship because it's focused narcissistically on the gratification of, say, one partner. So the whole thing has collapsed. That's what can happen in the context of that kind of relationship. But as we were saying earlier, when it comes to people who are very, very high functioning psychopaths like Epstein, very well connected politically at the Adlerian level, then the fallout is all over the place. It can be global because of the register, the height at which they'd achieved, their influence. Then the drop, when it hits the bottom, will go everywhere. It will dissipate out. So what we will see are lots of superpositioned effects. Superpositioning is something that I found people sometimes struggle with understanding. So a very simple way of grasping what that is to take George Engel's hierarchy, biopsychosocial hierarchy. There's a principle in that, which is that any given level has all lower levels simultaneously contained with it. And simultaneously, that given level that we start with interfaces with others at a higher register. So that should tell us that superpositioning is simply that. You take a given level, every level below it is still there. It's contained. That means that the overall field of that level and everyone below it is superpositioned. It's one thing and it's regulated at that level and it's sub-regulated at each level that is part of the overall field effect. So that simple explanation of what superpositioning is based on systems theory, the biopsychosocial systems theory, can carry over into the phenomenon of someone like Epstein. When the collapse starts to occur at the cultural and social level, which is where it has started, then the descent is rapid, and the libido that was being held at gratification at a high level starts to feed into disruption at every level below it. Until it hits individuals. And it can hit an individual who is not connected at all in any way with this stuff through the suggestion of the representation of it at the higher level. And the suggestion of the representation becomes a fantasy because it's not a personal experience, but the person thinks about it, they internalize it, they represent it, and then their own Freud starts to move towards it because this seems like a good idea. Charles Darwin told me, metaphorically, Freud could say, that if you could have that power for you, wouldn't that be good? And then anxiety, what do we do about anxiety? Fantasize. Fantasy will bleed it off. But after a while, it doesn't because it's repressed. It becomes a complex, and the complex wants feeding. And the ego struggles against that. And we can see how individual pathology can be brought about by exposure to people like Epstein at a high cultural level. And as Epstein drops down the stack, then the energy that was in him and in his circle starts to represent itself inside the lives of individuals. And one of the mediating factors, unfortunately, on the internet can be gurus, internet gurus. And if somebody's attached to a particular internet guru, then offers all of these explanations, but makes people feel vulnerable and attached to them, then that generates the neurosis, amplifies it, and we get a mess in people's lives. So it's the superposition field effect of all of these influences. But to go back to what you said earlier about a hypothetical case of someone who has a lot of religious ideas and motivations, but there are things behind that. It depends on if we're talking about influence, say from Epstein and co. It depends what they have within them to receive that influence. And some versions of Christianity are hyper suggestible to what appears to be their opposite. So the representation of evil in the language that Epstein and his circle talk about will find a ready receptor to bond with that at that level. And that will amplify the religious representation to protect the ego from the suggestion that they could be like that, or maybe they will be taken over by it in some occult sense. And then that person will harden around it and will start to project and transfer like crazy onto other people in order to protect the ego as well. But that may only work for a little while, because if they do have a fracture line in their personality, that is being homeostatically contained and regulated under usual conditions, that fracture line may break through, and what is latent within them that might be destructive may well come through. And it depends on the circumstances of that person, you know, whether they are triggered into beginning to act things out and see everyone else as evil, and they must have their time ended, that kind of thing. So you might get a paranoid psychosis with someone who's on a hair trigger like that is controlled by inflated religious ideas. I'm not saying that's the case at all in that hypothetical scenario that you mentioned, but it could be. It depends where they are and what they're doing. If they were, for example, in the position of passing judgment on someone, whether they should live or die in an extreme moment of selection, instinct provides the initial response to that, and it might be terminate, or they may harm themselves. There's a number of possibilities. So without knowing the specific context, it would be difficult to say beyond that. Do you think, Paul?
I was just to sort of segue a little bit from that. I was thinking about the collapse of I'm using the metaphor of the eruption column to represent the fall from Jung down through Adler and into Freud. I was thinking of the applicability of that to Epstein's situation when he was jailed for the final time, because to be put in solitary confinement, I'm following some of the discussion that went on during the Steve Bannon interview, principally, where Bannon keeps coming back at him about the fact that he was in solitary confinement, and he goes on about the size of the cell, and did he not anticipate that happening to him, and then how did he feel when he found himself banged up in jail in that way, because it seems from the way that Epstein responded to those challenges that he wasn't, I'm not saying he wasn't upset by it, I'm just saying he wasn't as disturbed as someone, an ordinary person who would, maybe, I don't know, fallen on difficult times and found themselves in a similar situation, or they become jailed because they were almost a political prisoner in some way. And so he seemed to adapt to that situation well, because he hadn't lost all his power. He was still able to influence people within the jail, for example, and beyond. Yeah. And so he didn't actually, his eruption column didn't collapse completely as it would do with the average person, even if the average person was a criminal, say, of some kind. So I find that interesting, because that, again, it separates him out from a kind of ordinary pathology that we might think of as evolving in that way, down through Jung, Adler, and into Freud, and then sort of bottoming out in Freud. He did not seem to completely bottom out in the way that the average person would have done under those circumstances. So we're just, I'm sorry if that's gone a little bit off message, but I just thought it was worth mentioning, because I
think it's very relevant.
Yeah,
because he seemed to stop at the level where he was still comfortable.
Yes, he did.
He was allowed to use a phone.
Yes,
and he was still contacting politicians.
Yes, he was
politicians.
Apparently. Yeah, from within his cell. Yeah.
So there's that, and the Jungian collapse in him may not have occurred significantly, because he'd enjoyed so much power and got so many people into that kind of thing that for him it probably seemed that everybody else depended upon him still. So it hadn't fully sunk in.
No, it hadn't.
What had happened.
Yeah.
And so the dissociation is local for him. It's not a complete collapse.
No, it's not a complete collapse. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I'm sorry if that's a bit, like I say, a bit of a segue, but it just struck me that it was important to mention that, particularly in relationship to the Freud-Adler-Jung Equation. Because not everybody, it seems, bottoms out completely.
No. But what happened to him is that he was taken out by Freud.
Yes.
And Darwin.
Yes.
On Darwin's instructions, you might say, which we're going to come to, aren't we?
We are. Yeah.
He was basically removed at that level. And that's spread out as a result.
Oh yeah, yes, it has.
Yeah, so by getting rid of him, you uncork the bottle.
Well, you do, and that would even bring in what you were saying a little bit earlier about meta instincts.
Yeah.
Because they play a part in all of this, not just the Panksepian ones. No. So you see, for example, somebody like Fergie approaching him and asking him to marry her and things like that, because her desire for the acquisition of resources as such, and she does apparently have a reputation for wanting and needing money and wanting to spend and have that kind of lifestyle, that she was prepared to go to him and go to those lengths of asking him to marry her. So that's a meta instinctual scenario in effect. A bit of a perversion of one, but nonetheless it is one.
It's Freudian again.
It's Freudian.
And Darwin again.
Yes.
The acquisition of resources.
It is. Yes, it is. Yeah.
Thank you. And that made clear sense. You took that to where, and a lot of times you do see what you just described, where it's a deletion process, and it's that polarity. I hope that's not over reductive, but you see it. It's a polarity change, a directionality. It's like this pressure is going to go the other direction, full force, unless you can find a stopping point. Like you just said, he found a stopping point temporarily.
Yeah.
At least, because he was still adaptive from the cell.
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, you see that full pressure change in polarity, and sometimes that's in real time. I mean, right in front of you, you can see that change. Over a very, sometimes it's a few moments to an hour or two, you'll see those polarity changes and all the energy goes completely the other direction.
Yeah. Thanks, Bob.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Important experience you've had.
Yeah.
And that's feeding in.
Yes.
To what you're sharing. That's hugely appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Let's go on to the next one. So this represents the process of actually looking at Epstein then through the lens of Freud, Adler, and Jung. We've already covered quite a lot of this, but the reason the metronome's there is that's to represent the beat of time of life. And very often when people are as inflated as he obviously was, they don't notice that, but it is still literally ticking away. And metaphorically, we can say that it's that's called those three spirits into overwatch of him towards the end of his time, that he'll be called into account to be measured against what they stand for. Oh, I think we can move on from this one. This would be a nice dinner party, wouldn't it? Yeah, it really would. So what we've got here is obviously Carl Gustav. He's actually taller than Freud, so never mind on that. But behind Carl, there's his shadow, or his concept of the shadow, which is a big, huge thing projected onto the wall. And with Freud, his friend the id. And we could, or any of us could, approach the phenomenon of Epstein through either or both of them. But which one's the most applicable? And for a Jungian, of course, it's going to be the shadow, because they don't believe such a thing as the id exists. If they look inside themselves, they don't see it, because they don't accept the suggestion that such a thing is there. The Freudians are the opposite. They never encounter the shadow, because for them it doesn't exist. So there's no internal projection of it. So that's from within the frame of a subjective collapse. But which one is more accurate? If we look at the concepts, I beg your pardon, the construct of the concepts of the shadow, and how that arose, just briefly anyway, for Jung, given his background, his circumstances, his father's religious faith, which failed him and impacted Jung as well, then there's a vestige, if you like, a vestigial remnant of Christianity in the notion of a shadow, or of a dark side, original sin, whatever you might want to call it, which Jung wrestled with in his own life all the time. But it also became for Jung a neurotic alibi, an excuse for his own behavior. And the construct of the shadow, we could say, historically emerged because Jung rejected Freud, and therefore rejected the notion of the id. Freud was perfectly satisfied with what he had uncovered in the psyche, the repressed psyche of his patients, that there was something pretty much like that, which was Paleolithic, primordial, and utterly driven for its own gratification. Something which had to be controlled, because if it wasn't controlled through repression, through displacement, or some kind of conversion, then it would turn into something horrible. So which of them really applies to Epstein? Well, as we said before, Epstein was aware that he had, he said it himself, a perfectly good mirror. So what would he see in his mirror? Would he see a dark shadow, or would he see a narcissistic reflection of his ego looking back at him, and he was quite content with that? I would suggest it's likely to be the latter, that he was content with what he could see in his mirror. He wasn't frightened by this dark inner twin, because for him he didn't have one. That was normal. That's what he was, and that's the case with people who we can broadly call dark triad types. The id is something different, because that is also something which is unpleasant to have to deal with, but you can do something with the id in a practical sense that you can't do with the shadow. The shadow for Jung, no matter what we do, it just adds to itself. If we do something, it does the opposite, or the potential for the opposite immediately configures. You can't escape it. It is literally a shadow that follows you around everywhere. But the thing with the id is that you can do something with that. You can gratify it, and you get rewarded for it by Darwin initially, until you reach the point of being pressure tested in a wider sense by society, because society doesn't like people who walk around expressing the id everywhere. There are laws and there are other constraints against that, but there are some people who are sufficiently integrated about themselves, we could say in a negative way, are quite comfortable with the instinctive destructive side and want to use it to gratify it and themselves. So I'd argue, I don't know how you feel on it, Paul, that out of those two concepts, then the id is the more important one, because there is no shadow, there's no golden shadow. Jungians go on about, for someone like Epstein, there's a hidden gold in the shadow, and for an evil person, then it's good. Well, you won't get that with someone like Epstein. He's not in the least bit interested in anything but his own gratification. He would manipulate a Jungian by utilizing his own model back at him or her to persuade them that he was being compliant with it and accepted it, whilst he would just go and do what he always did. That's what they do. They're not honest people, except to themselves, in the sense that they are self-accepting to do with what they want and their need to actualize it. So in that regard, I'd say that Freud's id is far more applicable in understanding human nature than the conflict Jung had with himself, which is that which produced the notion of the shadow.
Yeah. Well, it immediately connects us to the ancestral psyche. You know, the id, that representation of the id is Paleolithic, and we saw elements of that actually in Jung's own life. I mean, I thought it was interesting that you said about, you know, would you invite these people to a dinner party, because Jung was quite social in that sense, that he would have parties during which he would encourage the people who attended those parties to degrade themselves, which, you know, out of those two concepts is probably more representative of the id than it is of Jung's concept of the shadow. And we also know other things from his from biographical accounts that suggest that he would, you know, at family dinners, you know, as with his own family, he would eat his meal in such a way that it disgusted the other people who had joined him for dinner, and then they would leave the table and not want to sit. They couldn't eat because of it. So you get out of those two concepts, to me, you know, the id describes more of what was going on there than does the concept of the shadow, which I think, as you rightly point out, Steve, has you know, certain Christian overtones or overtures because of Jung's background and the way that his family was configured. So the id is, there's no doubt that the id exists, that the id is a real psychodynamic. I think Freud was absolutely right about that. And the concept of the shadow is far, far more of an abstraction, which I think is why people get caught up with it more, particularly, unfortunately, decent people. They're so vulnerable to that concept of the shadow, and then they use it destructively to harm themselves on the inside, that, you know, they could almost do with knowing about the concept of the id as a compensation for that, so that you can see at least that it's in all of us, and that it has been from the beginning of our human evolution. So in that sense, it's common to us all. And sometimes it's a good way to get people to break away from the concept of the shadow, because it you know, by and large, people think of it in its destructive form. There are very few people really talk about, as you say, what Jung would have called, or is certainly Jungians call, the gold of the shadow. People, you tend not to get to that point when we're looking at Jungian concepts. It's nearly always the shadow in this representation.
It is. And of course, the Jungians would subsume the id into the shadow and try and control it that way and say that's all it is. But the id is not only like that. You know, insofar as instincts are not only negative, and this is the problem with Freud, that there are very, very positive instincts, and not just Panksepian drives either, but the meta-instinctive scenarios that we have available to us. But it's one of the distinctions that we can make with the dark triad types, that they disregard those.
Yes. Well, Freud talked about archaic remnants.
He did.
It's a bit unfortunate that we don't start with him and then move on to Jung, because he was on his way to understanding archetypes, if you like, before Jung even you know, used or invented the term archetype or borrowed it from Plato, or, you know, whatever. The point is that, you know, we should give credit where it's due, and there's a tendency not to do that always. When we take a historical perspective, we kind of start where we decide we want to start. Whereas, you know, Freud is well on his way to understanding that as a concept.
He had a pathological inclination towards interpreting instinct, Freud, but as we said before, that's because of his patients, the kind of people he was seeing. But it wasn't big enough or good enough to be a general theory of human nature. So we could say it's personal to some extent, but I think Jung's was highly personal. And this construct of the shadow that could be individual or collective, and you can't get rid of it. No matter what you do, you cannot get it. But they talk about integrating it. How can you integrate it when they also say it's the entirety of the personal unconscious, or even the collective unconscious? Good luck with trying to integrate that. You know, it's like trying to squash the sun down to the size of the earth and fit it inside that. It just doesn't work. So the concept is woolly. It doesn't work. It's punitive and it's neurotogenic in and of itself. Whereas instinct's something that we can all feel, we can all understand, and we can take a position with respect to what we do with those instincts. And that's another thing that separates us off from, that's to say, normal people off from dark triad types, that they don't make that moral decision because their morals go back to gratification, and then they bring power as the vehicle for the delivery of gratification, and then they inflate because of the result, the reward that they've had. So we can see how that works that way. But well, I think we both agree, don't we?
Yeah.
That the Jungian concept of the shadow is useless when it comes to dealing with reality.
Well, it's only a short step from that to the concept of the devil, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And you know, Epstein was asked that question by Steve Bannon in the interview, and what I think is without wanting to you know, move into religious faith in any depth, I would just say this, that within Judaism they have a very different concept of the devil than Christians do, which I think is interesting, because it would actually fit more with this idea of being a kind of a moral complex, as you know, we would probably call it, or a superego, which mediates or challenges what we would think of as being Freudian id impulses. So it's more of an inner psychodynamic within Judaism, whereas this concept of the shadow unfortunately translates all too easily, I think, into the concept of the devil, which is unhelpful at times, because people then use that to attack themselves on the inside.
So Jungians would convert the id into a part of the shadow. Freudians would say the shadow is just the id, and you've given it a name to distract yourself from.
Yes.
And Adler would say that it's a neurotic alibi. You give yourself an alibi for your stated division of neurosis, and it's become a guiding fiction that you believe in that. And your fictional finalism is that you tell yourself that if you integrate the shadow, you'll be all right. Problem is you can't, because your theory tells you can't. So your internal projection organizes itself around that problem of being split forever, you know, because there is always that problem. And when they call it the problem of evil, and some Jungians do, that allows them to magically, alchemically transform it into a fantasy that they can distract themselves with. Meanwhile, that thing standing next to Freud is free to do what it likes. And as you guys know, an awful lot of first-generation Jungians were terrible abusers of women, male analysts, sexual abuse, and philanderers and the like. And they justified it by saying, well, it's what Carl did. What can you say about that, other than they've really integrated their shadow, haven't they? Whereas if they said, this is the id and it's a moral issue for me, and I need to sort this out, I need to take a perspective relative to instinct and utilize the energy and instinct constructively, that's more practical. Even the psychopath knows how practical that is, to utilize instinct. But the Jungians disappear into fantasy based on Jung's own personal neurosis. Hi, would anybody like to offer anything or question anything on that before we move on? Okay. Right, so this is a continuation, if you like, so we don't need to tarry on this too long, but here we have the judgmental representation, if you like, of Freud, Adler and Jung with respect to our man there, evil, ordinary and extraordinary, and insufficiency of character. So this is like a recap as well, to say that it's not about personality. Personality can be faked, it can be manufactured, it's malleable, it's a persona literally in terms of the root meaning of the word. But character is immutable, but it's expressed through personality. So if this guy was evil, and it seems that he was, then that's an issue of character and an insufficiency morally of character that came through. And when it does come through, as we said before, it operates through Freud, Adler and Jung metaphorically as representations for how that appears. But it's a fundamental disturbance, whether it's ordinary everyday evil that the Jungians like to call the shadow, or it's something extraordinary on the scale it was with him, because of its distribution, its global distribution in terms of its network at the Adlerian power level. So, anybody like to offer anything on that, or shall we move on again? Okay, what we have here then is a representation of Ghislaine. It may not be 100% accurate, but that's obviously what it's supposed to be. And here again, we have Adler conceals Freud. Power conceals its fuel, the id. Without the id, without the fuel of the id, we cannot empower. We can't do it. Even at a Panksepian level, we will not have the drive to achieve anything. We'll just flatline. But there are some people who have opportunities gifted to them, perhaps we could call it that, which allows them to draw on a level of fuel which is collective in its representation. This applies to Epstein as well, because his level of corruption was collective. And the Jungians might call that the collective shadow, but I think it's more applicable, given what we've been saying, to consider that to be the id at a collective level rather than the shadow. The only shadow element is that it was largely concealed from most of the world. But in terms of what its intent was, it was a positive feedback loop, positive in the sense that it increased itself, not at all positive at a moral level. It was very, very negative, but it inflated itself, if you like, from the level of Freud right the way up through Adler. And that was true for this particular person as well. And their relationship to the other person, obviously, I've forgotten his name, was that typical Epstein.
Oh yeah.
Not her father, although it's probably got roots in that. Her relationship to Epstein was a codependency of sorts, because in their relationship they were beginning to, wittingly or otherwise, access Jung. The idea of an individuation relationship, your complementary opposite, anima and animus, the syzygy, the divine couple. That's an element, a Jungian level element of corruption which is present in their relationship, which shows the inflation of it. It justifies and contains the expression of Freud and Adler at that level. So it would not have appeared to be wrong to them. You get this with as somebody said the other day, the Andrew who was formerly known as Prince. You get that with him, that he's utterly shocked by not being able to maintain his level of inflation anymore, and it's being pulled away from him. He's stunned. He's not able to react yet to that. But even he was a parasite to this woman and to Jeffrey Epstein. And by appropriating them, they added more of their libido, their pool of libido, to meeting their needs. So that's why it's the collective id, you could say, at that level. They parasitically fed off everybody that they influenced who was in a position of power, which moves them up from Freud to Adler incrementally by the number of people who contribute to their inflation. But for them, the Jungian elements, where they felt good about themselves, rather than thinking they were doing something, religiously bad, would probably come through their relationship and the confirmation that they received from one another. That would fulfill a perverted level of Jung, in addition to only fulfilling the religious element, although you could say that their relationship was probably elevated to a religious level. So what will happen to her is going to be really interesting, because she will have allies all over the world to do with a father, brothers, their extended, and I'm making no suggestion that they will do this, but people connected to them, and an influential network that will extend across national borders into other states, some of which have influence at the highest political levels in the US. All of that will have to be negotiated before something is done about her. Bearing in mind what happened to her father and her father's role as an agent for a government, a foreign government, I'll just call it that for now. But all of those things are going to be present, and she's held in stasis at the moment, whilst the rest of the field can figure some kind of response to her as a problem. But she's probably got something in common with Jeffrey Epstein, insofar as she has cards up her sleeve, and the only way they could be eliminated would be to remove her off the chessboard of life.
Mm-hmm.
But there are people who are likely to be protecting her for religious reasons, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. So what I'm suggesting is then that the Jungian level of inflation for her was operating through her involvement with Epstein, where they became a divine couple, a syzygy at the Jungian level, and that will be independent, and they could separate that off from the bizarre religious occult beliefs that some of the others indulged in. They would have been using those for them at an Adlerian level, whereas the others may have inflated into that, or those representations at a Jungian level. If the focus for those two was on themselves and on each other as a dyadic unit. So that's where to look for the Jungian inflation with them, even more than anything else. So within the confines of that relationship, if they were to be divided off from one another, though, then that would change. That configuration would predictably change. They would probably have to drop into the religious in order to scoop up some more energy from other people. Of course, they were doing that with their perverted practices, should we call them. They were borrowing energy off all sorts of people, borrowing their libido. And it's part of the occult practices that they're involved with. I'm sure you know this, that's it. It is to take the life force from others of all ages and various conditions. So it's almost vampiric. But the vampire myth is about taking the lifeblood, the life force, the life energy. And even the stories about Lilith have to do with that, but it's not blood, it's literally sexuality with Lilith that is utilized in a vampiric way to take the life force. And Lilith turns up in certain countries' mythologies, should we say, as well. So there's an understanding at a collective cultural and the Jungian collective unconscious level of what this symbolism actually represents, and how you can utilize that to feed other things, which result in the Freud-Adler-Jung equation, the negative side of it, being maintained. So,
yes, I was just thinking, so aside of, I mean, you're talking about them being a syzygy, kind of a royal couple almost, that aside of their victims, that they had a card basically of useful idiots in a way, who were prepared to literally feed in to maintaining them at that pathological Jungian level. And they're the people who are being drawn out at the moment, aren't they, really?
Yeah. And the link is corrupted Freud, and then with all of them, even if they have these religious fantasies, the thing that draws them in is always Freud, and then the temptation of Adler fueled by Freud, and then reciprocally the two then form a field, that's to say Freud and Adler in their corrupt form. So the gratification at a Freudian level then gives them power, power gives them gratification. And the inflation into the religious makes them feel special and untouchable and justified in what they're doing. So Freud-Adler-Jung works in those circumstances in that way. Right, would anybody like to comment upon that?
Could I just jump in there? Sorry. Just an interesting bit of background on her mother. After Robert Maxwell died, in later life, she wrote a memoir, A Mind of My Own, and also became a Holocaust researcher. And I'm sure Ghislaine might utilize that as well to her own advantage down the road. Becoming the victim.
Yes, there's a lot there, isn't there? There's an awful lot. I'm not familiar with that, but I can certainly feel into the representation that you're generating, that would feed in. Yeah. Because when people get corrupted to the ultimate level, it's as if they don't have a focus other than the corruption itself. In other words, the corruption is their ego. That's what they identify with, and they're comfortable with it. So whereas a normal person would struggle with everything that ever impacted them that was against the grain of their character, a person like that would utilize everything to feed into it and to justify it and to feel comfortable. And that's why they seem to be without a soul. They seem to be empty and hollow behind the mask, because there isn't anything really there at all other than the drive to gratify or be gratified at any cost. And we're seeing that with the Andrew guy now as well. His eyes are dead. There's nothing there. And he's an abomination, frankly, I would say.
It's all about self-preservation when it comes down to it, you know.
Yeah.
They'd hang anyone out to dry, really.
I think it's interesting what you say, though, Niamh, about that there is the possibility she might try and play the victim card.
Yeah.
And given that in this current zeitgeist, we're very accommodating of a kind of a victim mentality, and that might mean that at a kind of lower collective level, some people might even buy into that as a kind of a confession, even that maybe she brought, you know, the women in that she did for Epstein because at one level she understood what it was like to be a victim. I mean, I'm not saying that is true in any kind of real way, but this is how people like that will manipulate a dynamic like that to try and absolve themselves of heinous crimes, really. So again, it will be interesting to see how this all plays out. But I think it's an interesting point to flag up, because the way that the culture is configured, some people might buy into that as an explanation, and she might try and utilize that to get herself off the hook. So again, we need to not be naive about these things. If that does happen, I think it's important we don't consider that as being some kind of confession that is therefore in that humanistic way forgivable, for want of a better word, because psychopaths are so good at making themselves seem a particular way. I mean, they can, you know, the kind of shape shifting that goes on, the kind of manipulation of personality or persona that goes on would allow a lot of people to believe that what they're expressing is genuine, and it's just what any other person would do in that kind of situation. And of course, that's, you know, that's where we're all vulnerable to be taken in by something like that as a suggestion. So as I say, we have to not be naive if that is something that transpires in the near future, that if she tries to do that, we have to kind of be ready for it in a way.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very valuable point, Niamh, that you raise. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, so here we're introducing the other equation, which is the Plato-Darwin-Soul one. And it's interesting to introduce this here because this is a priori, it's before the Freud-Adler-Jung Equation comes online, and it's there at the end as well. So it's an opportune moment to look at this. So it runs Plato seeks Darwin, Darwin conceals Plato, familiar just like with the Freud-Adler-Jung, and the soul transcends and unites them both. So because we're thinking in a Jungian way, then the representation of the soul is feminine here, but it could be masculine. There's no problem with interpreting it that way. So Plato then represents the initial configuration, the initial drive, if you like, not only for psychology, but for everything to have evolved and to have developed ontologically as well as phylogenetically. That is the prime imprint or archetype, if you like. Jung himself borrowed the term archetype from Plato, but you have now people like Sir Roger Penrose and Michael Levin who are introducing Platonic ideas into biology and into physics, taking them seriously. But we want to point out again here that we use the term Plato and Darwin and even soul to be metaphorical for something which is beyond only the collapsed representation of them. So Plato then, for us here, would represent the original driving force behind everything, which is beyond even psychology itself. It goes as deep as mathematics and even beyond that. Darwin, though, comes into being before biology, because Darwin we would see as being the efficient cause of Plato. What we mean by that is that which selects, which causes selection to happen to allow Plato to become physical and to become psychological, what Michael Levin calls ingression, and what we've always called immanence. So in this we are on the same wavelength, if you like, or field wavelength, waveform as Michael Levin. But of course Plato is less obvious, and you have to get into Jung really psychologically to begin to get a glimpse of what that actually means and what it implies. And Michael Levin talks about archetypes too, but he doesn't say whether he means Platonic archetypes or Jungian ones, which is interesting because he seems to be hedging his bets on that. But for now, he just used the term archetype now and again for an organizing pattern of information. And he's producing an awful lot of work. It's interesting to see that he is going in the direction that we were in within our domain, which is depth psychology back in the 1980s. But he's doing it as a biologist, and he's doing fantastic work within his own domain. But Darwin is where biology comes into it for us. Darwin is, as we say, that which brings about change through competition, through polarity, through engagement. And Darwin is then the precursor to Freud. Freud becomes the efficient cause or deliverer of Darwin into human psychology. So we can see that this is the precursor element, but the idea of the soul as transcending and uniting them both, that is both Platonic and it is Jungian in a positive sense. But it's also Sheldrakean. When Rupert Sheldrake talks about soul, he calls it psyche, and he's very careful about how he says that. For him, he goes back to the original Greek word, and psyche is soul. It is mind in that regard. It's not the anima or the animus as such, but it can contain or be either of them. But what we would say, and I think Rupert would agree with this, is that we can say that it represents consciousness, the preparation to become conscious in an ultimate sense, beyond where we are at any point in evolution. So in that sense, we could say that the transcendence of the soul is the goal of the whole process. In other words, to become as conscious as is possible, immanent within the physical universe, which includes Darwin, but all the physical interactions that go on at the level of physics, and beneath that mathematics, and beneath that perhaps quantum information theory, and beneath even that the true Platonic domain. But the process dynamic is the same. And this is that which I hinted at earlier, which is behind the Freud-Adler-Jung equation. So would anybody like to ask anything clarifying on that? Be very welcome if you do. Okay, we'll move on from here. Thank you. Explain it again in a graphic way. So we have the spectral or transpersonal Plato seeking Darwin. And this is what we mean by immanence. They're superpositions together anyway, but this is the representation of when the Platonic field itself wishes by direct action to instantiate itself within biology as represented by Darwin. So Plato seeks Darwin. And we can all see Darwin. In other words, we can see it at work as a selective pressure at the level of biology, but we can't see directly Plato. Plato said that himself about the forms. We can't directly access them through the senses. They're in another domain or another state. We would say they are superpositioned. And it's only through the right approach to consciousness that we become aware of the reality, the immanence, the superpositioning or the ingression, to quote Michael Levin, of Plato with biology, with Darwin. So for the sake of moving on, then I'll move on to move through these. Okay, so now just as with Freud and Adler, where Freud seeks Adler, Adler conceals Freud, then as I've just said before, we don't actually directly access normally the Platonic, but we do the biological. So we can say then that Darwin conceals Plato. But wherever Darwin is, there are also all of the fields, the informational fields, which are organizing the biological, both in terms of their evolutionary or evolutional phylogeny and their ontology, their development. So again, we can say Darwin conceals Plato. This is going to become important with respect to Epstein and co soon as well. So we'll move on again. Okay, so this is where we start to apply this directly to Epstein, metaphorically basking by his pool at night. But on the right, we have Plato looking down on him as if in judgment. And then as a further judge, we have Darwin with the world suspended from a thread and a pair of shears. So he's in the role of the fates here, that which brings about things to happen in the world. So if Darwin were to cut the thread and the globe of the world would drop, then metaphorically that would be the crash that would occur at this level for all of the connections that a man like Epstein had developed for himself. But of course, this applies at a global level as well. And when the Platonic pressure test is brought to bear at a biological level across the globe at a species level and beyond, then this pressure test can impact life right across the world in every niche space that it occupies. But it has a personal relevance as well. If Epstein cannot instantiate or ingress Plato because he has a disordered character, then he's problematical. He's problematical to others. And what the suggestion is, metaphorically, that will only be tolerated so far. And at some point, then Plato becomes Darwin, and the Darwinian selective pressure will be applied directly to Epstein, and it will come through Freud, Adler and Jung, because this equation then turns into that one. And whilst he's blissfully unaware of it, as if he's half asleep, that does not prevent this process from happening. And this explains field effects that occur, and they're happening now, not just through direct communication between people, but through indirect Sheldrakean field effects. And as you know, we consider Sheldrake's morphogenesis and behavioral fields to simply be the Platonic field itself seen from a different angle, a different resolution of focus, but they're probably the same thing. That's where the homeostasis at this scale operates. So he went too far, he became inflated. The regulation is then going to arise from a deeper level and then start to manifest itself through the Freud-Adler-Jung Equation. So this is the challenge he was probably unaware of, and he may well have protected himself from it through his religious beliefs. Any questions on this one? Nope. Okay. The next two actually are just continuations of that one with some captions on, which I've already explained verbally, so there's no point going through them. So long as you get the idea that that's what's happening in the background and how these two equations. Right, so now we need to look at the positive Freud-Adler-Jung equation and see how that links in with the previous one, the Plato, Darwin, and Soul. Freud seeks Adler, Adler conceals Freud. Yeah, that still works in exactly the same way, but this time Jung individuates, uniting Plato and Darwin as the soul. Interesting, isn't it? Because when Jung individuates, that means he's moved beyond Freud and Adler. And that's exactly what he said to do. He said, sort out Freud and Adler first before you approach his work. And then the process of individuation can occur. And Jung's ideas are full of Platonic representations and suggestions about how things should develop. And if by following a Jungian path, because we've dealt with Freud and dealt with Adler, we're then in a position to unite the physical, the biological world with the transpersonal, in other words, Darwin with Plato, then we will achieve what Jung intended that people should achieve for themselves by working on this process within their own life. So this is the positive Freud-Adler-Jung equation, and it's very different. Are there any questions on that before we move on? Nope. Okay. Right, so this is what I've just described. Basically, if we get it right, if we get Jung right, then we have a synthesis, and Jung will transcend Freud and Adler. And when we're at this position, then because Freud's work is completed in the lifespan of an individual and Adler's is completed sufficiently, then they welcome the approach we make to Jung. But if you remember, with the negative side of the equation, if we don't get those two right enough, then Jung is necessarily corrupted by the route that we've taken thus far. And in the case of somebody like Jeffrey Epstein, then, who was obviously a corrupt individual at the level of his character, then he was not able to complete those two. And when he moved into the level of Jung, that was going to stimulate Plato and even Darwin, then in a loop sense, to constellate against him and bring his downfall through the other two. So this is positive Jung at work. Any questions on this one? Is it self-explanatory? So the goal of the positive Freud-Adler-Jung equation is the synthesis of Plato with Darwin. This is the individuation process. But there's a fourth factor there, which will be the soul. So arguably then, from a Jungian perspective, this notion of soul or psyche actualizing itself is fully integrated with both biology and therefore materialism, and with Plato and therefore with transcendent idealism, can occur in the conscious life of an individual who is individuated. Question is, did this happen with Jeffrey Epstein? And this is a really moot point, because is a person like that capable of individuating? And if they are, what does it look like? If someone has a disordered character and that is all that they are, does that prevent them from individuating? We've said in the past, for example, about Adolf Hitler, he individuated and 60 million people died. And maybe Jeffrey Epstein's body count was nowhere near as high as that. But the dynamic is the same. Someone with a fundamentally disordered character individuates by becoming what they are, and as a result of that, all sorts of other unpleasant things happen. So can a dark triad person individuate without changing into something that is not a dark triad personality or character? I would say they can, because they can't change. Therefore, as soon as they do optimize themselves, they have, by definition, individuated. They have gratified themselves according to their basic nature. So individuation in and of itself is not a good thing. It depends who and what is individuating in order to find out what will arise out from that. So any questions or observations on that anyone would like to make?
Just a brief question there about, so with that individuation in a dark triad, would it just appear as refined? I mean, you identify the pathologies, but it's refined. And is it truly individuated when at some juncture under the right circumstances, it collapses? Because it seems like individuation wouldn't collapse, like Epstein collapsing at some juncture. But as we said earlier, he really didn't. He got stayed, but was functioning at the level he could within the constraints. So is it, under the right circumstances, would it not collapse back at some point, even though they're refined?
Yeah, that's a great point. It depends on the degree of insufficiency of character that a person has. I mean, there are some people who are dark triad adaptively for Darwinian purposes. In other words, they have to be that way to survive. And then they ego identify with that configuration. And they're people who can be helped in theory. But there are others, no matter what you do, they are bad. They are just fundamentally bad, and they are immutable. And I would say that those people who can change don't reach the excessive proportions that Epstein and his close circle did. They are absolutely the worst case configuration of a human being. But there are people out there who functionally appear to be psychopaths and they're not given a chance. But you can invest a huge amount of time and effort in trying to help someone who is that way, and they will resist you, even when they could be saved, if you like. They could be helped. I don't think he could have been. There's no evidence that he could have been. The fact that he appeared in an interview with Bannon, who was obviously promoting a Christian form of attack and defense against the configuration that Steve Bannon was experiencing, he reacted like a confident demon would. And therefore that would feed back into Bannon. And that might be why he did it. It might be in the moment he was getting sport playing with this person who had a religious belief, and then didn't respond directly to it, but indirectly, in order to generate a dissonance within Steve Bannon, who, when I watched that interview, he wouldn't shut up. He just kept going at him, wouldn't let him finish. The aggression that was coming out of him was almost as if it was someone out of one of the vampire movies, just holding up a crucifix. That's Dracula, trying to fight him off by attack. Now, a predator like Epstein will just soak that up, use the energy, feed it back, keep the other guy off balance, and then drop that pearl of a statement in about, oh, no, the devil scares me. You should be scared of me because you said I'm the devil. And then what I'm saying to you is that I have a very good mirror. In other words, I know what I am. I know better than you do what I am, because the way that you're coming at me shows that you're vulnerable, that you're weak, that kind of thing. There's so much in that was superpositioned that says without a doubt the guy was a psychopath.
Yeah, in that moment he told him what he was, but Bannon wasn't listening.
No.
As you say, he was in there like an attack dog.
He was,
so he missed the opportunity, golden opportunity, to understand what he was saying about himself. And probably because he couldn't, maybe he was incapable for whatever reason of receiving the message as it was delivered by Epstein, which was a statement from him to Bannon about who and what he was.
Yeah. Some of them are so wrapped up in their identified with status that they would find the completion of their life in their own death, but spiting everybody and getting off on it. You know, a lot of mass killers are like that. You know, they either don't confess or they don't say where the bodies are and don't relieve anyone with suffering, no remorse at all. And they just exercise their power to the very last moment over whoever they're talking to in the moment. Obviously, you'll know this, Bob, with your vast experience in dealing with such people. That's how he came across. He was almost transpersonally superpositioned, and people who would sense that might interpret that as he's the devil, Satan, Lucifer, whatever. Whereas he knows he isn't. But you enjoy people believing that about him because that's still feeding off their libido.
Apex predators.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And I think that at some, this may not be correct, but at some juncture when I look at, human beings all have the capacity. I think all's pretty hard statement, but human beings have the capacity to be an apex predator. Each of their own, I mean, if we look at animals, they're different and each has its capacity. And so it's a matter of nature. What's its nature? What's this person's nature? What's the animal's nature? Sophistication and magnitude. So there is a capacity element there. What's their nature? You speak to character. What's the magnitude of what I'm dealing with here? So according to their individual nature, sophistication, and magnitude, individuals have the capacity to be an apex predator, and I think that can be pro-social or anti-social. So I think we like he's missing it. He's right in front of him saying, "You should be afraid of me," and there's a cautionary note is that I'm open to each person individually in their capacity. With sufficient pressure, you may get a polarity change and see these capacities manifest. I say that one has to be always open as to what is this person individually, their nature, sophistication, and magnitude, and recognize when you're moving things about what it is you're moving about.
Yeah, great, brilliant. Thank you for that. Based on real world experience. Thank you, Bob. Would you like to offer anything at this juncture? Okay, let's see about moving on. So with respect to the Plato-Darwin-Soul Equation, then, if we follow the Jungian individuation route, the positive version of the Freud-Adler-Jung Equation, this would be the result, a kind of quaternity, which Jung would no doubt have approved of because he likes things like that. Then following that, then we will be able to integrate our own relationship to biology and the physical world, to the idealistic world of the Platonic sphere, and then also achieve a higher level of consciousness. But this has to be in balance. But what about the other guy? What about Epstein? Could he do this in some perverted, corrupted way? I don't think so. I think he can individuate, but it would stop at a lower level. And it would essentially stop at the level of Freud and Adler as corrupted, because the Jungian level that he would achieve would not be real Jung. It would be the corrupted version that had nothing in it at all that could lead him into a Platonic understanding. And even though the guy was quite well educated in matters of philosophy, mathematics, and other things, they're just ideas, they're abstractions. In order to access them, you'd have to have a capacity to relate differently than simply exploiting people. And that did seem to be the fundament of what he did. He exploited people for his gratification. So it would be like an academic who only knew that. Everything was just an idea. Everything was abstract and couldn't be related to in a lived way. It was just a concept. And that may have been why he was drawn to a lot of this stuff, in order to do that, to try to compensate for the fact he'd only reached a certain level. But his corrupt character meant that he couldn't. He couldn't go beyond where he was at. So what's likely to happen? The corruption would be repeatedly overamped in a cyclical sense. It would reach a point of frustration, it would go back and recharge itself. He'd siphon some of that energy off to attempt to bypass the state that he was in, his innate character, to achieve something that was higher. And the reason I say that is because he did have interest. He surrounded himself with intellectuals, people with new ideas. He liked innovation. He liked basically intuition. So intuition would be, at one level, a fantasy medium through which he could get beyond the limitations of his own nature, but he was being pulled down all the time by the collapse down through corrupted Adler into corrupted Freud. And then eventually the Platonic caught up with him through Darwin, and Darwin through Freud, and again through power, because it's been at those levels so far that he's been compromised, including the end of his days. That was essentially a Freudian move through Adler to eliminate him as a problem. But that still left the web of associations intact, and we can see how the field is attempting to configure in some kind of balanced way in response to that. And it's not clear which way that will go, because he did have an extremely wide field of corrupted representation. But if the higher levels can be accessed at a sufficient amplitude, then that will, through a morphogenic and morphic resonance behavioral field Sheldrakean model, that will begin to propagate. And then we might see what Jung called an enantiodromia against the way that this corruption has gone on a generalized level. So the conclusion would be then he was evil. He was evil because he had such a gross insufficiency of character, he could never get beyond where he was at. the fact that he was stuck, but he had some potential other than that, fed into gratification, and that just proliferated massively by exploitation of other people's corrupted Freud and corrupted Adler. And he fed off that in a parasitical way, but eventually homeostasis reacted against him. Shame it didn't react sooner. But it seems that it did. And he never really achieved a transcendent or transpersonal level, but that would have been the level at which the process of removing him started, because homeostasis operated its highest register at that level because it's concerned with a global level of interaction. And that's only local, of course, because it extends beyond just this home planet that we occupy. The ultimate level of regulation is way, way beyond that, but it's certainly at a higher register than an individual human being in their network. So we'll see what happens. That's the psychosystems analysis collective representation. So we haven't gone into the lurid details. We don't believe there's any need to do that, because it is what it is. We know what that is. We know what that evil is. But to understand the regulatory patterns and the field interactions and how those two equations interact, in our view, is important, because they operate in the lives of individuals, ordinary people who suffer in an ordinary way. But they don't operate in the same way, but they operate through the same means. And when we're attuned to Freud, Adler, and Jung in the right order and in the right way, then the Platonic will come online for us, because we're working for it. And that means even Darwin will calm down and put the shears away. When, for some people, unfortunately, when they don't make the effort in the right way, then Darwin is ready to cut the thread at any moment, in the manner that the Fates did in Greek mythology. So that's it.
So that final statement that you've just made, Steve, that's open to anyone who suffers. They can achieve that transpersonal level of transcendence if they work their way through Freud, Adler, Jung. In that way, they can achieve that.
Yeah.
And that has to be the goal, of course. And I think it's good to know that. I think it's certainly good to know when you start out on that journey that it is possible to reach that place.
You're intended to.
You are intended to.
That's what we're offered from the beginning, isn't it?
Yeah.
We start at the instinctive level. That's the ancestral preparation for survival.
Yeah.
And then the social level comes in at Adler, and then we're meant to deal with that.
Yeah.
And then some of us can get beyond that. But if we go to Jung too soon, without understanding what went before and what's beyond Jung, will never emerge for us. We won't do it, and everything is just a fantasy.
Yeah.
Which is obviously what's going on with the internet guru culture at the moment, where millions probably of young people around the world are being misdirected by nonsense.
Yeah.
Because they're not engaging with life. They're not going through the process of being pressure tested, of failing, of getting back up and trying again, not giving in, and certainly not giving in to evil.
Oh, okay, yeah. So I think there's a key point in there, not being pressure tested, and it's easy for people, young people, possibly more so, but it's easy to for people to want to avoid that pressure testing, and it's only really through that ideally voluntary participation, and you'll see high performers pressure test themselves purposefully to find their limitations, right? And thrive in that, because there is a limit. Everybody has a limit in whatever at any individual thing, and it's in knowing those limits is the empowerment. Otherwise, you are living in fantasies and utilizing fictions, and so. But I think it has to be okay to go. You have a limit as a capacity of in some fashion or other, in context. And find that, and then now you know who you are. If you don't like where that is, you maybe have the capacity to improve upon that. But subjecting oneself, voluntarily participating in that pressure testing is, I think, without that, developing is going to be near impossible.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And we don't need to mythologize it as the hero cycle or anything like that, which you tend to get. The Jungians indulge in all of that, and it's a fantasy. It's not applied to life, individual contexts. So when we mythologize it to that extent, meta instincts don't come online. They give up. They just say, oh, yeah, you're in the sandbox. You're not really engaging. They withdraw, but at the same time, there's pressure. Even Michael Levin talks about what he calls positive pressure from the Platonic. The Platonic is pushing them to ingress all the time. And in our domain, we see exactly the same thing. But we also see this tendency to generate fantasy substitutions for real life. And Freud argued for that. But there are people out there who are pushing fantasy as a replacement for real life. Internet gurus, some of them are even medical practitioners. We should know better. It's awful.
Mm-hmm. Well, this was wonderful. I appreciate it. Very enlightening.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much, and thank you for everybody who's been with us today. It's been a bit of a long one, isn't it? But really appreciate it. So we'll get this sorted into appropriate shape. And thank you for your attendance and support. It's really grateful to see you. Thank you. So we'll see you all soon then. Thank you.
Thanks
everyone.
For your time.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You take care.
See you soon.